Hello and welcome everyone. We are stoked to have you all. I will give you all a minute while we wait for everyone to get situated and dialed in. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll because we're curious to see what brings you to today's webinar. Is it educational? Are you a current prevalent customer? Are you bored and just want to hear the sound of our voices? Either way, just let me know. Can't forget about some introductions. My name is Ashley and I work in business development over here at Prevalent. And we are joined with two very special guests, our very own project director, Joe Tolley, and our very own content manager, Thomas Humphreys. And of course, I can't forget about Scott Lang, our very own VP of Product Marketing. Hey, Scott.
Hey, Ashley.
And just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out the recording along with the presentation slides shortly after the webinar. You're all currently on mute, but we do encourage participation. So please put any questions in our Q&A box so we can go over them at the end of the webinar. Today, Thomas and Joe will be exploring the pros and cons of using SOC 2 reports in your TPRM program. So gentlemen, I'll pitch it over to you.
Fantastic, and a very good morning, afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Let me go into presentation mode. So, as Ashley was very kindly introduced, we are here with you today to go through SOC 2, discussing what SOC 2 reports are and sort of how you can use them in the best and most practical way within your existing TPRM, or if you're just starting up a TPRM as well. My name's Thomas Humphreys. I am the content manager. So I work to develop assessments and frameworks within the Prevalent platform, particularly focusing around information and cybersecurity. And with me is Mr. Joe Tolley. Joe.
Yes, thanks, Tom, and hello, everyone. So I'm the project director at Prevalent. I spend a lot of time working with clients to get their programs up and running. Usually have some frontline experience of some of the challenges that clients have as well. More recently, around the focus area of SOC 2s being presented instead of assessments being completed. So it should be a good, interesting session.
Fantastic, thank you. And just to reiterate, we have a session that's going to run for up to an hour, but at the end of the session, we'll hopefully have time for some Q&A. Hopefully there is a dedicated Q&A window for you to type in any questions. We will answer any at the end of the session, but along the way we may dive into some if they're pertinent to the area, to the slides that we're discussing at that point in time as well. So without further ado, let's have a quick look at the agenda. So we'll start getting to grips with what SOC 2 is and what we typically see within SOC 2 reports. We'll then start to focus on some of the challenges of coming into contact with SOC 2 reports for the first time and how they can sort of hamper your wider risk management process. We'll then look at the other side of the coin and how you can start to blend what you can get out of SOC 2 and build it within your wider program and use it to strengthen parts of your program and your engagement with third parties. And then we'll touch on risk management elements and how you can extract some of the actions and activities from a SOC 2 and build it into your wider sort of risk management approach. So let's make a start with getting to grips with SOC 2. So SOC 2 is being used across more and more industries and sectors as a recognized framework and a way for organizations to demonstrate the delivery of security controls, in some cases privacy controls as well. So it's used to help demonstrate a level of best practice based on a scope of operations and products and services they're delivering. It's delivered by breaking down into 5 key groups called the trust service criteria. And this provides a framework for going into detail on specific controls and control points. As we see from the bottom of the screen, these split up into security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, so the CIA triad, and then privacy as well. These SOC 2 reports, what's notable about them compared to some other attestations is that they're viewed and reviewed from an independent with an independent eye. So with independent auditors and auditing bodies will come in and assess organizations against these series of controls and control areas, and then provide the final report that summarizes the best practices that are in place, and in some cases where there are issues or deviations or exceptions, which is terminology that SOC uses. One of the key things to note as well when you see a SOC 2 report is that each report is slightly different, and we'll go into some of the perhaps reasonings behind that and some of the challenges behind that in a short while. What this means is it allows organizations to scope an assessment to fit their own needs, to ring fence based on a full encompassed business operation and operational control, or looking at particular aspects of what the business does, particular business units, operational areas, operational infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a dynamic report, but ultimately gives a viewpoint of where an organization is at a point in time, and the effectiveness of the design of their controls and how those controls are being operated, and the effectiveness of those operations as well.
Yeah, and Tom, a quick question from me, if I may.
Yes.
We obviously have a lot of clients coming to us asking us what to do when they're provided with a SOC 2 instead of an assessment. So it'd be great to hear from you. I know you spend a lot of time working with content and building out assessment content for us.
Yes.
It'd be great to know how the SOC 2 or the trust criteria align to other standards and frameworks that might be more traditionally used through an assessment process, like a SIG assessment or an ISO 27001 assessment, whether it does cover the majority of those controls, or if there's any sort of clear areas to be aware of or cautious of when we're provided with a report.
Very good question, and yes, as you said, particularly as we're seeing more and more in organisations presented with SOC 2 or SOC 2 seen as a good way to demonstrate sort of governance and delivery of security controls. There are actually increasing mappings we're finding between SOC and other frameworks. Now, obviously you mentioned ISO, you mentioned NIST, SIG, and NIST is also perhaps another common framework to focus on. There is a lot of commonality that we can see from these areas. So to take the security control group, for example, trust criteria look at pertinent areas around data encryption, around access control, the use of access right reviews, and using privileged accounts to manage access to critical systems. And this actually mirrors quite nicely some of the areas that the likes of ISO and NIST go into as well. So we can find that there is a lot of similarities. And when you start to compare the two frameworks together, say SOC and SIG, or SOC and NIST, or SOC and ISO, to take those three examples, there is a lot of similarity. It is important to point out, and this is there that we'll go into in the short while as well, is understanding where those gaps are. And so if you think about, for example, the NIST framework, 853, as we know from NIST, it covers a lot of control areas similar to SOC, but then also goes to another level and covers a lot of technical detail around areas that perhaps SOC doesn't go to that length. And so it's important to realize where those sort of gaps or variations lie. Yeah,
perfect. So it sounds like it's a good indicator that controls are in place. They've obviously
absolutely
got themselves independently assessed to be able to provide this report. So it's a good indicator that they're mature from a security standpoint and consideration standpoint. It sounds like it's more about making sure the scope of what's covered within the reports meets the level of detail that you're looking for from an assessment standpoint.
Absolutely, and you sort of hit the nail on the head from two aspects there. One is that independence. It's always a bit more comforting, isn't it, when we see sort of attestations and reports where we know there has been an independent eye cast over the operations, processes, procedures, policies an organization has used or implemented to demonstrate that what we're putting in place is good practice. But it's that scoping piece, which again we'll go to over the next couple of slides, which is very critical and can also be part of the challenge to work out, is this scope very much ring-fenced and isolated, or is it all-encompassing and covering a wide variety of aspects of this business and what this business does?
Great, thanks, Tom.
So taking a short look at what a SOC 2 report is, and I'll go into detail in terms of how to pick apart a SOC 2 report and some of the key areas to look at. But one thing to note is that actually being faced with a SOC report, and particularly when you're faced with multiple SOC reports for multiple organizations or vendors, it can prove quite difficult in terms of understanding and working out where do we go from here? What should we be looking out for? So SOC reports contain an extensive set of information, which can make trying to identify all those pertinent areas quite difficult. If you think of an organization that is all-encompassing within the SOC report, every part of the business operation and functions we want captured when we're reviewing against security, CIA, and privacy, for example, to take that extreme. It means that the report can be quite large, quite lengthy, and go into a lot of detail, into a lot of individual areas. So trying to pick apart and understand, well, when we think about that third party or that vendor and what they're going to be providing to us or what they do provide to us, is it clear from the outset what that report is trying to say? And are we able to identify the parts that are important to us based on the product or service delivery? Now, one part that's also key to mention is the level of inconsistency. So you could have two vendors, two organizations that are presenting you with a SOC report. Both may be having very similar service deliveries. Both may be, say, application or system developers, for example. But the fact that each individual organization can affect, suit the scope of the SOC to fit their own business, you could have two very similar businesses, but one that which, say, only focuses on security and the security side of the trust criteria. And you can have another organization that focuses on security with confidentiality and maybe privacy as well. And so each report can end up being very different and looking at very different aspects. And so that, again, that question of, is what this report is saying and being presented to us, does that actually align with what we're after, what we're engaging this third party to do to us? And of course, if it doesn't, and if they've ring-fenced it so much that it's looking at other areas of the business that are actually nothing to do with the product and service they're providing to us, how do we take that? Is this still a useful document? Can it still show us the best practices and overall good use of security and having a good security posture? Or do we need to look at and ask other questions? And obviously, outside of all of this, we need to start looking at, well, how can we take this report and where there is this haystack of information, this expanse of information, and how can we make it fit what we're doing, and particularly when ingraining it within our own TPRM. Yeah,
and it sounds like, Tom, from the way you described it there, these text-heavy, long reports that, a haystack of information, as you described. It sounds like at the point we're provided with this SOC 2 report, we have to be aware there's going to start to be inefficiencies in our typical assessment process where we're asking questions and we're getting back binary responses as to whether control requirements are in place or they're not in place.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like we're going to have inefficiency, but it's all about being aware of the inefficiencies that we're going to encounter and preparing for them, so that these types of processes where we are reviewing reports don't take us by surprise. We have ways of approaching it, and if we are given a SOC 2 report, we're not prepared for this type of exercise, it's only going to add to that inefficiency while we actually decide how we're going to manage this SOC 2 report being provided to us.
Absolutely, and being able to get to a stage where we can say we've got this single or series of SOC reports, but through our process and the way we've been able to identify the pertinent areas, the areas that matter to us, whether it's the findings, the context of what the business does, it's only going to make it a lot easier in working out how closely aligned are they to the typical assessments that we're using for the rest of our third party base, or our wider third party set of companies. And so it can be quite a manual process, certainly, but yes, there's certain sort of tricks that we need to do to make sure we prepare ourselves in the best possible way in terms of understanding what these SOC reports are about.
Yeah, and I think from a process standpoint as well, there's going to be other considerations as well, like as soon as we stray away from our standardized assessment process where we have our scorings in place and our thresholds and everything's defined and optimized, as soon as we go down this other route where potentially there's a misalignment in what we're asking or the information we're absorbing, it's going to mean that we can't then compare vendors to other vendors from a reporting standpoint. Risk profiles are going to differ between those that went through our standard assessment process versus this process. So I guess one thing we should always try and do is push for vendors to go down our typical assessment route, where we do get that 1-for-1 with what we're looking for. And then should that fail, or should a vendor not be willing to participate in that assessment, then go to this style of approach where we accept some of those differences in how we're going to get results from the data.
Absolutely, and again, as we'll see as we go through the discussion today, the more obviously mature, but the more that we see a third-party program where there is a very clear understanding of risk and the way risk is managed, and the way assessments are designed, and the way the type of assessments we're focusing on organizations, it'll only make it easier to then adopt and understand and get to a point, hopefully, where we can say we can accept the SOC 2 report, and actually it meets, hopefully, the majority of what we're expecting vendors to provide us anyway, when we engage them or when we go through that process. It won't necessarily always be 100%, but obviously the closer we can get to that stage and the more aware we are of what's important to us as a business, what are those mandatory elements and controls that we need to focus on, obviously the easier that process is going to be.
Great.
So, why SOC 2 reports can hamper your TPRM. So we've already discussed this idea of SOC reports being complex, or horribly complex, a lot of information, a lot of data. Like all frameworks and best practices, SOC is not a stranger in this fact that has a lot of unique terminology. The way it describes findings, it describes exceptions, the way the report is built and has auditor attestations, auditor summaries, and management responses in the way that they respond to the findings of the auditing body as well. One thing that's quite interesting about SOC is they have two particular phrases called qualified and unqualified. An unqualified auditor report, or a SOC report, sorry, and a qualified SOC report, and these basically demonstrate the responses of the auditor. So where auditors may be finding findings, but they're not enough to demonstrate an inability of processes or material weaknesses in the control environment, which is unqualified, versus qualified, where there still is DA and OET testing, design testing, operational effectiveness testing, but there may be some issues that are found that one or more controls are deemed ineffective, and there needs to be more focus on what those ineffective controls are. So there's some unique terminology that you find in SOC 2 and the way that the reports can be presented, and obviously understanding that type of terminology, again, will help when we work out how can we use this to the best of our ability. I mentioned obviously at the start, one of the large parts was the expanse of information. And this is what's typically called overview of organizational operations. And this can cover a lot of different topics: system scope, individual components, tools in many ways, different frameworks an organization uses, their IT and network infrastructure setup, and user responsibilities. We've seen SOC reports that have the nth degree in terms of type of controls we use, type of tools we have within firewall system setups, for example, intrusion detection systems and event monitoring solutions, as well as how the network operation is structured and the data mapping. When it comes to the scope of the report as well, I've already mentioned, obviously, this can vary from vendor to vendor. What we mean by this is when we have a look at the TSC, or the Trust Service Criteria, and we have those 5 areas from security, CIA, and privacy. We can get some reports that only focus on security, some that only focus on security and confidentiality, and some that offer all 5. And so from vendor to vendor, despite doing very similar work and very similar processes or service delivery, you can get some reports that are far more complex than others and offer a far greater insight into some of the controls that they're working with. When it comes to SOC 2 as well, we have two types of reports, some that are focused more on design, type 1, and type 2 that offer more operational effectiveness of the controls. So when your auditor goes in, not only saying, do you have policy and process for these areas, such as access or encryption or processing arrangements, but how are they actually operating? How are they working? Are they operationally effective? And then, of course, auditor experience and depth of coverage can vary as well. And what's important here is that you can have multiple auditing bodies who provide an auditor report, but each report can look very different, despite the fact that they may all be SOC 2 type 2 reports. And I guess the trick here is understanding, despite there being different variances, because of different organizations carrying out and conducting and delivering these reports, it's knowing those areas to look for in terms of commonalities in how exceptions are reported or presented, or the way we can pick apart and identify what controls have been assessed. So there's a lot to unpick about an individual SOC report that can give a lot of headaches and certainly cause a lot of confusion.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to touch on in a bit more detail, Tom, is scope. I understand that obviously the scope of controls might vary, but from my experience with looking at a few SOC 2 reports, usually they're focused on a particular scope of service within the business as well.
Yes.
So when we receive one, and in lieu of an assessment, we have to be very careful that the scope of the report that's been provided to us matches the service that we're actually consuming from that vendor as well.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So I know one thing that we're always recommending clients to do is make sure we have enough context internally about the service that's being provided. So if you are a representative of the TPRM program, for example, and you're receiving this SOC 2 report, you already have as much information from the business owner, for example, as to what the service is that you're consuming from the vendor, so that you have enough of the context to make sure that the report matches what's being consumed by you. And that way, there's no misalignment and potential areas of risk or controls that aren't covered.
Yeah, very much so. And yeah, completely agree. The more we have visibility of obviously what the vendor, what the organization does, and particularly when we have identified through that scoping of report that actually, yes, this does cover those same areas, those same operational controls, that same infrastructure, for example, or those same services, it then becomes a far more value-adding service, and enables us to, I guess, more accurately do a deeper dive in terms of what controls are important to us based on that service.
Yeah, I think some of the sort of profiling questions that we recommend that we ask internally from business owners when they're onboarding a vendor or requesting to onboard a vendor include the location, for example, that the service being provided from, what type of data is going to be interacted with. Also, I think we cover off, how the service is being delivered as well, just so we have those validation checks that we can perform to make sure that, we're ticking those boxes. Yes, this service does match exactly what we're expecting.
Exactly. Absolutely. And by being able to unpick that type of information from the SOC report based on that overview of organizational operations can help immensely in working out, particularly if you go through a tiering exercise of saying, based on the complexities of what they do, and for example, the data aspect and the way data flows throughout the organization, do we consider these to be a critical tier 1, priority 1 vendor, or can we bring them down to a tier 2, tier 3, priority 2, priority 3 vendor? And the more information we can gauge and ascertain from what we know about the vendor and what the tool provides, the better.
Good stuff. Thank you.
So you looked at the complexity of a SOC 2 report. Now let's look at the other side around a TPRM program, a program that's already been built or is going through a stage of developing. So we're looking at designing a set or single or siloed or multiple set of assessments. Let's say we're choosing to go down ISO 27001 to assess our vendors against or NIST, or maybe a collaboration of multiple assessments. Maybe we're using, say, ISO and some GDPR, if we're looking at some privacy-based requirements as well. We start to design a different set or multiple set of assessments with which to ask questions of our vendors. And those questions can be geared towards different tiers as well. So more complex assessments for tier ones, more of a light touch approach or mandatory controls for the tier 2s, 3s and 4s, for example. At some point, we'll need to develop and establish a risk process and a risk program. So how we identify and manage risk and get to a stage where we can start looking at treatments, remediation and mitigation controls and mitigation processes as well. Throughout this process, and as you mature and establish those assessments and different types of assessments, we then look at those mandatory control requirements based on industry or sector, or based on other risks that we've encountered as a business. Are there particular controls that we want to enforce when we engage the vendors? Maybe it's, if we're looking at companies where they're holding sensitive data, there may be a lot of data security-based control points that we'd expect vendors to implement and have to demonstrate that they have implemented sort of best practice for the way that data is secured or transferred or stored. And so we can automatically see that we could get to a stage where we're looking at certain programs, let's say 27001 or 853 in NIST, but then they're also presented with stock reports that may not contain all of that information. They may not have some of those mandatory control requirements, particularly if we are presented with a SOC report that it turns out is only focused on one particular aspect of the trust criteria. So if you think of the scenario of a company that's sending out security and privacy-based assessments, and the vendor then presents a SOC report that only focuses on security, we then know from the outset, before going into that assessment, that there's going to be a whole ream of questions and control requirements from a privacy perspective that we know that won't be answered. And so we then find that problem of, can we accept that SOC report from a security aspect and still issue them a privacy assessment? Do we still ask them to fill out both security and privacy assessments? How far mapped are those SOC controls, and how far apart are they compared to our wider TPRM program and our delivery of mandatory control requirements? So that alignment between what a SOC report delivers and the business assessments that we're sending out to our vendors is where we can see a lot of potential gap and where we need to focus on in terms of extracting what's in the SOC 2 and where does it fit if we layer it on top of our business assessment.
Yeah, and I mean, each of these sort of bullet points you have on the right here, Tom, really interesting. You know, specific sets of assessments, questions geared towards different vendors, risk remediation, mandatory control requirements. These are all parts of a sort of well-oiled assessment process. But as soon as we're given that SOC 2 report, these are all areas that sort of detract from that and tend to sort of stray the workflow off on a different course. So I think making sure we are preparing for this use case as much as possible to pull this process back in line with our sort of standard workflow, the better. And obviously, the earlier we can do that, the better as well, so that we're prepared for these types of scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the more mature, I guess, the TPRM program is, and the longer it's running, if it's that well-oiled machine, let's call it, it can make it, in many ways, easier, I think, personally, to bring areas such as SOC attestations and SOC reports in, if we already know how we're going to approach managing risk and risk assessments, for example, how we're going to classify sort of impact around risks or exceptions, to use the SOC terminology. And again, that's something that we can go into in a short while. So if we take a step back, let's think about, well, what are we trying to achieve here, both with SOC 2 and when we receive SOC 2 reports and our TPRM program as a whole. So one, it's about establishing that vendor's security posture or privacy posture, whichever the focus may be. But principally, I guess from this discussion, we're talking from a security angle. So how well ingrained is security within the organization's operations, systems, best practices? Can we align SOC controls to our own TPRM requirements? And that should always be one of the aims. How closely can we align what the SOC requirements are with what our existing requirements are, existing assessments are? And obviously, the closer we can align them, and obviously the closer the gap, or the smaller the gap, rather, obviously the easier it's going to be. Not always the case that you're going to get 100% mapping from assessment to assessment, of course, but the more we do this up front and the more aware we are of where those gaps are is going to make it much, much easier.
Yeah, and this is where you're pulling that process back in line with the original workflow here.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes. And then, of course, that whole risk structure that sits around it and how you respond to risk. And likewise, if that's structured in an appropriate way and you've thought about how you deal with risk and acceptance criteria and managing remediation, when it comes to exceptions or risks raised from a SOC perspective, again, it's going to make it so much easier. So we need to make sure we've established what the vendor's doing and the security posture and the best practices they're following. If we've aligned, or we need to align that level of control and overlay it with what we're asking vendors to do from other business assessments or security assessments, and then making sure we've got a formal process to manage and manage risk, but drive continual improvement through the remediation process. So let's take a step back now and look at the report itself. So I mentioned earlier that you can have multiple auditing bodies, multiple certification bodies who go out and conduct the audits, and they provide the SOC 2 reports, the Type 2 audit reports. But each one can look slightly different. The way it's laid out, the way they describe auditor summaries, for example, maybe the way that the management of the organization being assessed responds to exceptions, if exceptions are being raised. However, despite these differences, there are some common areas that's worth highlighting, some of which we've already covered. And it's being aware of these areas and where to look for that will make it so much easier when presented with a SOC 2 report and working out what do we need to focus on.
Yeah, so it's not a case of always going to this particular section name where you're going to find X, Y, and Z. There's going to be a sort of loose framework or a process to follow to identify the right information, but it's going to require some manual interrogation of the data.
Absolutely, yes. It can seem quite a manual process, but yes, you're right. Although some of the terminology and the phrases will be different. For example, there will always be an area of the report that focuses on, as I've called it, that overview of the organization's operations. So as you can see here in this report example, they have aspects that touch on components of the systems, different aspects of the control environment, communications, and the company background. So what's being scoped out in terms of what does the company do? So this is an area that you'll always find regardless of the auditing body conducting the SOC 2 assessment. And that's really the best place to start. Making sure we're fully understanding how expansive or how isolated or siloed the assessment has been. The scoping in more detail, scope and the description of the services provided. This is where we can start to see the different trust criteria that they selected as well. So there'll always be areas of the SOC report where we can dive deeper to understand, are they covering all the 5 aspects of the trust criteria? Are they covering one? Are they covering a mixture of those areas? And of course, scoping as well in terms of the operational areas that are being covered. So as well as looking at the overall technical side of operations, if we can focus on that scope of, does this align with what they're providing to us as an organization? It'll make the process of understanding and reviewing the SOC report so much easier. And there'll always be an area, typically closer to the end, section 3, 4, 5, where we go into the detail around the actual control activities. So we're looking at the trust criteria, and we're looking at the auditor's response and the auditor validation. So we're looking at the criteria around access controls or incident management, for example. And it's here where we'll find some of the auditor statements around effectiveness of controls, whether there are exceptions or whether there are no exceptions. And this is where we start to piece together how effective the organization's approach has been to delivering these controls. And of course, where there are exceptions raised, you do find a level of management response as well, which is where there's always an opportunity, particularly throughout the audit, where management have been given an opportunity to say, acknowledge the exception or non-conformity in ISO speak, and this is our approach, this is our plan of attack, or this is what we've done to address it, or this is what we're doing this is what we will be doing to address it. And having that level of detail can help so much, particularly when you're trying to bring those control exceptions from the SOC into your own TPRM and starting to work out what level of remediation do we need to go through, what type of tasks or mitigations do we need to ask of the vendor. If they've already got some of that information, it makes that job so much easier.
And Tom, from a control standpoint, what are the things that we'd expect to see consistently between these reports? Do they always refer to the controls as the same sort of names within there? And what can we look for to start that alignment process?
Yes, so there is some consistency because they're all using this same trust service criteria. Each of the individual criteria controls will have control identifiers in the similar way that ISO has with its Annex A controls, A dot something. These will have, for example, common criteria controls that always start with a CC and a respective number, and that will be consistent throughout, regardless of which auditing body is conducting the assessment. And there'll also be some consistency in terms of where the auditors report on exceptions, for example. So you can start, and it's done in a very tabular format in terms of this is the requirements, this is the investigation we carried out, and this is the result. So there is some consistency there, particularly if you want to very quickly get to have there been any exceptions and what are they? And just knowing this will make the process a lot quicker to sort of digest the report.
Yep. Always helpful when there's a table of information at the back of the report.
Absolutely. Get to the crux of the matter. Should we be worried or not? Absolutely. So if we move on now to look at more from the TPRM side. So we have our SOC 2 reports. We're aware of some of the key areas we should be looking at in terms of what the business does and if there are exceptions or issues or risks. So before we even got that report, however, are there things we could be doing within our own TPRM program to help prepare us for when we receive these type of documents? Absolutely. One of the first things is conducting that gap assessment. So if we take ISO, for example, or the NIST 853, if we already know that this is the assessment that's going out to vendors and they're assessing them against, having a clear idea of how far do the SOC 2 controls across security through to privacy are captured within NIST 853 or ISO 27001 or cloud assessments or any other framework that we're using. So having that gap assessment where we can work out there's 80% coverage, there's 100% coverage, less likely, but as close as possible where that gap is, where do we need to focus on? I mentioned obviously this idea of mandatory controls. Many organizations already have a clear idea, not only once they've established, say, we're going based on NIST or ISO, but we know where our critical controls are, particularly if we're going through a tiered approach of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 vendors, and maybe further down the road as well. And obviously, if we've identified those mandatory controls, we know that through the mapping of SOC 2 to ISO to NIST or anything else, we can also start to map where those mandatory controls are. And obviously this will make it much easier if, say, an exception arises in SOC 2. Let's say there's an exception against a lack of data encryption at rest controls, and there's some exceptions that have been raised there. If we know that this is considered a mandatory control from our wider ISO framework, we know that we need to pay this a bit more attention, and perhaps we need to spend a bit more focus on, well, why is this exception existing, and how do we engage the vendor when approaching remediation for that control. And of course, what's critical and underpins all of this is identifying that process of managing vendors where those SOC reports do not have the coverage. And this is quite a conundrum sometimes. It's, in many ways, we see obviously organizations that do not want to fill out an assessment. We're saying, please fill out this ISO 27000 framework assessment. It's 150 questions and covers everything from A to Z of ISO. And they say, well, we don't want to fill this out. Here's a SOC 2 report. And we know that the SOC 2 report, if it contains, say, 80% of what ISO contains, there's a gap of 20% additional questions from ISO. What do we do then? Are we willing to accept that SOC report and say, well, there's good coverage, there's no exceptions, they meet 80% of what ISO asks for, case closed? Or do we offer a tailored approach of saying, well, it's covering 80%, but we still need that further 20%, because there are areas that are covered in ISO or NIST or SIG that sit outside of what SOC is asking for. And because we consider these key areas, we still require you to complete an assessment, but very much a reduced or cut down assessment, because you've already got the validation through that gap assessment and through mapping SOC to ISO controls, for example. So identifying that process of what do we do where there is a gap, and how do we approach that with our own vendors? Do we offer them an isolated or simplified assessment, or are we willing or happy to take the SOC 2 results as a good representation if they are to complete our own assessment or our own framework?
And this is where, I guess, profiling and tiering becomes even more important. If we know that the vendor provides a particular service to us and they're really, really important to us, then some of these key controls or some of these gaps might be multiplied purely because of the fact they're so important to us and we need to know this information. Whereas if they were slightly lesser importance to us, perhaps our risk acceptance sort of tolerance might be slightly lower, and we'd be more willing to accept some of these gaps in coverage.
Absolutely, yes, and that's a very good point, because of course not only is every vendor unique, but when we think about that tiering process, we'll have a different view of what's expected from a tier 1 versus a tier 2 or tier 3, and particularly when we get to a stage of some companies that are very, very small, almost those mum and pop shops you find in the United States and in the UK, where we have maybe 2 employees or 5 employees, very small organizations. So the way we address security in those will certainly be very different from the large software houses that we may be engaged with, for example, or the global organizations. So yes, it does play quite a critical role, I think, in that decision process for how we're addressing or how we're responding to SOC 2 reporting. So we've got to a stage where we've done a gap assessment. We've managed to map the control requirements of SOC 2 to our own TPRM program, and we've got a stage where we have built, or we're starting to build, a risk process, a risk management process, a risk framework. So we can then start to do a deeper dive into, or more confidently do a deeper dive into, where there are exceptions that have been raised in the SOC report and how we deal with them. So we mentioned earlier, Joe, that yes, there's some consistency in terms of how reports are published, and particularly in terms of the way that auditors report on results. You'll see from the screen here that we have a series of columns and rows that identify the trust control area and the control criteria, activities that the organization says they do, the testing that the auditor does, and then the necessary test results. And we can see from the far left, we have a control number, CC 3.4, and then the far right, we have two columns, two rows. One says no exceptions noted, and second with some information about an exception that's been raised. So if we think, if we've already identified and mapped those SOC controls and the trust criteria control numbers to our own third-party assessment, it's going to make it a lot easier of knowing where to place the exceptions when it comes to putting them into our own risk framework and our TPRM. If we've already identified that CC34 aligns to ISO clause A.6, for example, and it's a similar control, we know that there's a one-to-one mapping there. We know that if this exception is raised and it relates to the same area that's covered in 27,001, we know where to place this control within our risk framework. And so having that gap assessment first makes it so much easier to know what do we do with these exceptions, or at least where do we place them? How do they align with a similar, maybe not directly, but a similar question that we would have asked had they completed their ISO assessment, for example.
Yeah. And from a reporting standpoint, does the SOC 2 report provide any guidance on next steps or recommended actions resulting from these findings?
So it's, yeah, the assessments are quite interesting because one, there's a few things that you may see from here, and as you go through a SOC report that are lacking. So we can see that the auditor has given details of a control or a lack of control, so lack of visibility for identifying structural or operational change as part of an annual risk exercise. I mentioned earlier that there is a sort of manager or management response as well. And there's dialogue between the auditors and management, and it's through these areas and these areas of the report where we can start to see actions being taken or actions being proposed. So we can start to piece together not only here's a gap or here's a gap or an exception that the auditors raised, we're already starting to get an action plan and an idea of the story, you know, so what's behind it and what's being done, what's being proposed is done to address it. One area that is missing, you might note from here, and if we continue on to the next slide as well, is so you have your exceptions, and it may be creating a new risk if it's an area that the SOC maybe identifies but your own assessment doesn't, or maybe an area that say you're able to map. But what about how do we classify this? So you've got an issue here. There's no root cause analysis. There's no system impact or resolution as part of incident tickets and incident monitoring and incident reporting. So is this a critical risk? Is this a high, medium, or low risk? What's the impact? What's the likelihood of this? So these are areas that the SOC report doesn't contain. And that's why it's then so very important to have that established risk process. So that if, for example, we know that we're following, say, an ISO 31000 or a NIST RMF risk management framework best practice approach for how we identify and classify risks and how we categorize them, high, medium, low, red, amber, green, whatever is appropriate, will make it easier to say, we've got a risk here. There needs to be something done to tighten up the way incidents are being managed or incidents are being addressed or recorded based on our own risk management process, and maybe similar risks we've seen from other vendors who've completed a similar scenario, that we can classify this as a critical risk or a medium or a low risk based on our own acceptance criteria and the way we classify these type of risks. So it's important to note that we can have a series of exceptions but until we go through some of the detail or until we align it to our own risk approach, we need to work out how damaging is this to the business or our own perception of it? How much of an incident or risk is this to us? And are we prepared to accept it based on the management response or based on what's being captured as part of the auditor detail?
Yeah.
So the actual risk approach, it's obviously managing SOC exceptions the same way as risks in your wider TPRM. So I mentioned if you're using a best practice, say ISO 31000 for risk management, for example, you should already have a fairly good idea of how to identify, say, impact over likelihood, what type of risk scoring. particularly if you're using existing risk management tools and tool sets to help drive this, to help document and record risks and assign risk remediation. Obviously, as part of this process, should be identifying risk acceptance criteria, and at what stage would you be willing to, say, accept low and medium risks and not accept high and critical risks and demand some level of mitigation or risk remediation. Once we have that process in place and we're able to extract those exceptions from the SOC report into our risk criteria, it then makes it much easier to work out, what are we doing with these exceptions? Do we need to re-engage the vendor, or are we confident based on what they've said or the level and severity of that exception that actually we only need to monitor it, or we don't need to take any further action? So having that structured risk management approach in place will only make it easier to work out, what do we do with these exceptions?
And from a process and workflow standpoint, this is where that deviation of workflow based on being provided a SOC 2 report suddenly joins back into that, straight line assessment workflow that we'd fine-tuned, because now we're managing risk in exactly the same way.
Absolutely. And that's what we're looking for, right? It's that streamlined approach. It's an approach that still it's giving us that value of what we're trying to get out of the SOC assessment, that still demonstrates the effectiveness of our TPRM as well. And of course, the more detail we're ascertaining from the SOC report, and if we've got a process set up and how risks are captured and identified, it then makes it easier in terms of how we present this internally or to senior management, or even back to the vendors themselves. So if we've got clear mapping of exceptions to standards and regulations, perhaps we're already putting that within our risk process. So we're classifying risks based on particular areas, incident management, for example, and SOC controls. Maybe we've got existing risk types and risk registers that we're using around information security, cybersecurity, ISO 27001. We can start to record how those risks have been established and how they've been formed, and using more of that SOC auditor's descriptions to help to build out that risk. So what type of risk is it? Is there a name? Is there a clear description? Can we use the wording straight from the SOC report? Are there recommendations based on the management response? So it's trying to extract as much of that data and information as possible from the SOC report to tell that story within our TPRM. And of course, what makes this, can make it an easier process is if we're starting to see commonality between exceptions raised through SOC reports and other risks in our platform from other vendors. So if there's consistency there in terms of the type of incidents, type of risks being raised, that can help us make that decision of how critical is this as a risk area, particularly, of course, if it's an area that we've deemed mandatory as a mandatory control that we're trying to focus on. So it's really taking as much data and trying to know how to extract that information as much as possible from the SOC report, and putting it into our own processes, our own practice, of managing third-party risk.
Yeah, and then we maintain that sort of full auditable trail of how we've managed a SOC 2 rather than just blindly accepting one, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I think that's the key point, isn't it? It's building it out in the most efficient process or the most efficient way. So it's all about focusing around the pros and the cons of SOC 2. And I think it's clear there's sort of both sides of the coin have interesting sort of areas to contribute. With the depth that a SOC 2 report can bring, a SOC 2 it can provide a lot of insight into what the vendor does, their operations, the level of detail of how infrastructure is built, is designed, and maybe critical tooling that they use to secure data or data processes, for example. We are finding that more and more standards are doing mapping between SOC 2 and I say the likes of NIST and ISO and many, many more. And I think this is only going to continue as SOC 2 becomes more of a almost go-to tool as a way to demonstrate best practice. And it could be a good demonstration of a good posture, particularly given the fact that it is, as I say, an independently assessed It's not just an organization saying, we're telling you what we do, take it. It's also independently assessed by an auditor, and they've given their professional view on whether these controls meet the requirements. On the other side of that coin, however, that information can be overwhelming, particularly if you're still trying to work out what the vendor is doing for you, what product or service are they supplying. And as I say, if the scope is very much ring-fenced, and if it's identified that the scope of the SOC report sits outside of the scope of services that they're providing to you, how do you take that? Are you still going to say, we can still use it as it's a demonstration of best practices across other parts of the organization? Or do we need to reject it because it's actually not fulfilling the areas that we'd expect it to fulfill in terms of the type of operations or infrastructure or systems that they're supplying to us? That inconsistency between different vendors, the way they can ring fence and look at different scopes, and how that impacts your wider TPRM program. So again, that example of if your focus is on data privacy, for example, but the SOC 2 reports don't cover the privacy arm, how do you take that? How do you address it? You still need to have further conversation around asking vendors to complete privacy-based assessments, for example. And where that gap is between what the SOC asks for and your own assessments and frameworks. If there's a small gap, say it's 80, 85%, 90% coverage between what SOC 2 and say ISO asks for, does that mean you can accept SOC 2? Or is there sufficient enough gap that it's only giving you half the picture, and there's still a lot of control areas that are missing and that you need to engage further? And is this slowing down the process? And that's a key point as well, because obviously what we don't want to do is get to a stage where it makes the process slower, because we're having to filter through and manually review so many different control documents, particularly when the end result is there's such a small gap, there's such a large gap, sorry, between what it's offering and what we're asking for.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Thomas and Joe. Let's go ahead. We got about 3 minutes left to get through some of these questions. You guys may have noticed that I launched our second poll while they were still presenting. As we go ahead and answer that, we greatly appreciate it. But Nadia asked, with new privacy laws and TPRM changes coming up, would a SOC 2 report still be enough to give us an accurate view of an organization's security posture?
Very good question. So yes, what's interesting is there's a lot more, and you're right, particularly from a privacy perspective, and view of how TPRM is being managed. There still is a lot of benefit. I think there still will always be a level of benefit of what a SOC 2 can provide. As is the case with all of these frameworks, at a point in time, the trust criteria will be updated again, and I'd expect when it does that it would reflect some of these changes as well. That's quite a common approach, but nevertheless, at the moment, there will still be there will always be a gap. Let's put it that way. But I think what's important is to be mindful of how big a gap that is, because that could be the difference between saying how much we can accept a SOC 2 or not.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Thomas. And I appreciate everybody's questions. We did have about 40 plus questions, and unfortunately, we just don't have enough time to get through them. So Joe, I'm going to let you go ahead and dig through some of these and pick out something you think will be useful.
Sure. I think a good question here is if more than one vendor and all have various different frameworks, then how to proceed. I know, Tom, you've had a lot of experience with mapping numerous frameworks to singular assessments. So I think it's all about the preparation. You know, if you're seeing that commonly you're provided a particular framework based report, then, you know, that mapping is something you should prepare for. And I think that content's always going to evolve. You know, if you're suddenly seeing more and more different frameworks being presented to you, it's all about making sure you find the time to prepare your content and perform that mapping as accurately as possible.
Yep, completely agree. Yep.
Let's see if we've got time for one more. Would there be a process to follow up with the auditor that conducted the assessment regarding the remediation of items that resulted in the qualified opinion? How do you feel about that one?
Yes, that's an interesting question. It can be difficult sometimes because, of course, the auditor is contracted by, say, vendor A to conduct the assessment, and so it's up to them whether they want to engage further with another company that's not tied or associated with them. So I don't want to say it's not possible, but I guess the best practice would be to go through the vendor first, or the organization you're engaged with, and for them to ask the necessary question and data. Technically, I guess there's no reason why the auditor can't be engaged, but I guess the key thing there is it's not under their they're not what's the word, contractually agreed to, but necessarily if there is something, I guess, that's fundamentally an issue within the stock report, or there's perhaps a major exception, and the report is not so clear, it's going back to the vendor first to clarify what was discussed and what action plans had been agreed between them and the vendor.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much, and everyone, for all of your questions. I do apologize we weren't able to get through all of them, but if you do still have questions, please feel free to email us after you receive the copy of the recording in your inboxes. They gave us some great information to take in today, so I hope to see all of you either in your inboxes or at a future Prevalent webinar. Cheers, everyone, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you all.